The first half of December 1968 was not too cold in Kyiv. Citizens gladly took advantage of it, spending evenings in pleasant walks. One of the favorite spots is the botanical garden of Kyiv University. A pensioner walking her dog that night saw a girl sitting on a bench with her eyes shut. Who could have thought that the girl was dead? The ID found in the girl's pocket revealed that it was Anna Khristenko, an instructor of Kyiv City Komsomol Committee. Komsomol, the Young Communist League, was one of the most influential organizations in the Soviet political system. Only young people with immaculate records could count on pursuing a career in this institution. No visible signs of violent death could be detected upon the initial examination. Her heart stopped beating about 2 hours ago, and it looked like for natural causes. An indirect proof of that was the untouched cash and seemingly quite expensive medallion left in the purse. So it definitely was not a robbery. A more detailed examination made criminalists revisit their original conclusion. What looked weird was that a few buttons on her coat were unbuttoned and her hand was out of the sleeve. The girl could have done it herself, but why? A forensic expert noticed a fresh needle prick on her hand. Whoever made the injection, they missed the vein several times. A blooded cotton tampon was found by the bench. Thus, the injection was made right on the spot. If she did it, a syringe had to have been around. A detective found a button clamped in the girl's palm. The button was not from the clothes she wore. There was another detail pointing at the presence of someone around at the time of death. A criminalist found a fragment of a fingerprint on the button, as well as on her cuff button and on the chocolate foil found in the victim's pocket. The bite on the chocolate had to be examined too. Forensic team reported that adrenaline content in the victim's blood was 40 times above the normal, which was a result of a lethal injection. 2 bites of the chocolate belonged to 2 different people. An experienced attorney led the investigation team. Seeking to draw up a list of Anna's contacts, the detectives went to the Komsomol committee where she worked and found out that the girl left the office at 5:30 that day. She asked to be relieved from a meeting scheduled for 6 p.m., referring to the splitting headache. Having checked Anna's desk, officers found a note. 10th of December, 6:45, X-ray. Her staffmates knew nothing about it. Anna never mentioned any X-ray. All of the office workers were sure the headache was a symptom of some disease that ultimately killed Anna. The information about it being a murder really shocked Anna's colleague. She recalled that Anna had a conflict with Nikolai Ostrozub, head of the Ideology and Propaganda Department. The two dated for a while. Nikolai proposed to her. They even set a wedding day. Out of a sudden, a week ago, the girl publicly announced at the office that the wedding is off. Nikolai tried to convert it into a joke, but his infuriation was quite obvious. He waited till everyone was gone and lashed out at Anna with insults. He yelled she undermined his authority and threatened to kill her. He was so enraged that he did not notice an involuntary witness of the incident. The staffmate shared a rumor she heard. Anna found a new boyfriend. The detectives wanted to speak to Nikolai Ostrozub, but he was not in the office. As he heard about Anna's death earlier, Nikolai's face changed and he asked for a leave. Checking his file, officers learned that the young man had a degree in veterinary. Therefore, he sure knew what a lethal dose of adrenaline is. At an interrogation, Nikolai claimed that last evening after 6 he went to see his friend. 2 points caught the detective's attention. First, he asked to be relieved from an important meeting, even though seeing a friend could be rescheduled. Second, his way to the rendezvous passed through the botanical garden where and when Anna was murdered. Nikolai did not hide his frustration with her infidelity. He said he thought about dealing with the rival. The young man saw Anna's boyfriend by his office, wanted to walk him to a private place and to beat him up. However, at that point, his boss called him and started scolding him for the bad report. Nikolai could not see the man in detail, but he remembered his coat, dark gray with fur collar. A standard and commonly worn coat could not serve as a lead. Nikolai was detained for further checks. A 24-year-old Anna Khristenko is found murdered by administering an intravenous injection of a lethal dose of adrenaline. Most likely, the young woman did not resist and offered her hand voluntarily. Nikolai Ostrozub, her staffmate from Kyiv City Komsomol Committee, is a suspect. He has a motive, medical skills, and has no alibi. At the time of Anna's death, he was in the vicinity of the botanical garden where the crime was committed. The detectives wanted to verify Nikolai's testimony and went to see his boss, who confirmed seeing Anna with a young man. His face, though, was hard to see. By that time, the officers knew that originally Anna was not from Kiev. She came from the city of Orol 4 months ago and got herself a good job at once. Such things don't happen without patronage, and there is no way her boss knew nothing about such a patron. The men reluctantly admitted they had received an instruction to employ Anna from the City Communist Party committee. One could only guess about Anna's connections. A couple of times the boss saw an executive-class car giving her a lift. However, the vehicle would stop several blocks away, not to publicize it, and then the girl walked the rest of the distance. The car belonged to Professor Lyubomirov, a surgeon well known in town. The committee secretary concluded that there is a romantic relationship between the girl and the professor. Professor Lyubomirov headed Kyiv Municipal Hospital No. 2, and the detectives made their way there. Talking to the doctor appeared impossible, though. It turned out he was placed in intensive care with a heavy head injury. Last evening, the unknown robbers violently broke into his apartment. Detectives saw the professor's son and ex-wife waiting by his ward. They were shown Anna's picture, but they had never seen the girl before and knew nothing about the doctor's ties with her. As Professor lived alone, he might well not share the details of his private life with them. Both the son and ex-wife had alibis on the time of the murder. The son, who was a GP, was at work busy with patients' admission at the polyclinic. The ex-wife was at the movies with her boyfriend, who she openly referred to as a lover. Neither of them had the slightest idea of who might rob Lyubomirov's apartment. The woman wondered if the list of missing items includes a medallion. A description of the jewelry perfectly matched the medallion found on Anna's neck. There was something sticking out of the logical picture. The girl was wearing the medallion before Lyubomirov's robbery took place. The detectives went to the robbed apartment where the housekeeper met them. The woman was very scared but was committed to staying at the place until her employer comes back. She immediately recognized Anna in the picture and called her the professor's mistress. She added that the aging professor completely lost his mind over his love. The housekeeper saw Lyubomirov present Anna with the ancient medallion, a family relic. Professor said he wanted to engrave a dedicatory inscription on it, but a jeweler talked him out of it. It would seriously devalue the antiquity. Professor also begged Anna to move in, promised to get her registered in his apartment. The girl really longed it, but she was anxious that Lyubomirov Jr. would go mad over her consent. Professor tried to reassure her that it would be no problem. His son had his own place. The housekeeper told that Professor loved his son Kirill, even though he was not his native son. After their divorce, Professor's wife moved to live with the son, but their life together was not a bed of roses. Kirill had frequent fights with his mom. To avoid scandals, he would often stay at his father's place. He even introduced his fiancée to his father and not to his mother. On leaving the apartment, the detective saw a dark gray coat with fur collar hanging in an open closet. One button was missing on it. Exactly the kind that was clamped in the dead girl's hand. The coat was taken for examination. Now the whole picture looked quite consistent. Professor found out his young mistress was dating other men and went jealous. Making an intravenous injection was a piece of cake for him. The only unanswered question was who robbed Professor's apartment and whether or not it is tied with the Anna's murder. The examination confirmed that the button on Professor's coat perfectly matched the one found in the victim's hand. The thread, however, was different. Professor could have easily explained that these are standard buttons attached to every other coat. A detective got a call from the hospital. Professor has come to. His doctor disallowed any visits, though. The patient is still very weak, recognizes no one. The detective chose to go examine Lubamirov's office. That moment, a radio show, Finding the One, started. The doctor accompanying the officer said that it was Professor's favorite show. World War II made millions of families break up. People lost each other in chaotic evacuations, displacements from occupied territories to Germany, loss of documents. The famous poetess Agnia Barto came up with an idea to launch a radio show helping people find the ones they were looking for. This program, titled Finding the One, premiered on Mayak station in January 1965. For over 10 years, the whole country was holding breaths, listening to stories of those who lost their near and dear. The doctor told that Lubamirov was one of those who was found due to the show. When Professor found out that somebody was looking for him, he did not believe it. But then he was told that it was Margarita who he shared his wartime life with. His fellow soldier lived in the city of Oriol. They exchanged letters. Then Margarita came to visit him with her daughter. She had a medical checkup at the hospital. Margarita's diagnosis was disappointing, the incurable kidney damage. She could not be helped. The woman died in a few months. Talking to his workmate, Lubamirov told he had an affair with her during his war service. Margarita's family name was Khristenka. Her daughter's name was Anna. Lubamirov checked up the girl. The disease could be hereditary. On Professor's desk, the detective found Anna's medical file, according to which Anna underwent an X-ray in early December. The officer called for a radiologist performing that X-ray. The man remembered Anna quite well. Her kidneys were in perfect order, but she still was very concerned. The doctor said that for 100% certainty she may want to go through the contrast X-ray. There are several machines of that kind in Kyiv. Besides, he heard that through acquaintances a patient can be given Italian iodine instead of the commonly used domestic ones. The contrast radiography came into practice in 1930s. At the time, substances were created which would absorb X-rays, remaining relatively unhazardous for a human body. They could be either swallowed or administered intravenously. This technique allowed to better see internal organs like stomach, intestine, bladder, kidneys, and vessels. The detectives came up with a new assumption. Anna is not Professor's mistress. She is his daughter. It explains why Professor helped her get a job and invited to move in, was giving her generous presents. The detectives decided to find the jeweler, who Lubamirov consulted with, and to find out what inscription he wanted on the medallion. The jeweler recalled an elegant customer and his medallion. He indeed talked the man out of engraving on the precious jewelry. The jeweler's logbook kept a record of the inscription. Lubamirov requested, "To my daughter." The detectives also sent a query about the Italian iodine to the Ministry of Health. Among the medical institutions to which it was distributed was the polyclinic in which Lubamirov's son was working. Meanwhile, Professor's condition stabilized and the doctors allowed the detectives to talk to him. The patient had no idea who attacked him. He was hit from behind. However, it seemed that the man was not telling the whole truth. Then the detective asked him to talk about Anna. Lubamirov said that this subject was in no way related to the attack, but the detective insisted. Professor learned that Anna was his daughter from his wartime sweetheart Margarita. The woman did everything she could for her daughter. She realized her days were counted, and there will be no one to help Anna. If it weren't for these tragic circumstances, Lubamirov would have never known about Anna. Margarita asked him to take care of Anna after her death. Lubamirov did not say a word about his daughter to anyone. He wanted to avoid unnecessary gossips. He did not want his ex-wife to learn about this dramatic twist. She is a very scrappy and scandalous woman. They were in the middle of their divorce process and she could misuse this information. Professor pretended he was caring for the girl as an old friend of her family. Yet some time ago he shared the truth with Anna. He presented her the medallion, wanted to register her in his apartment. Lubamirov hoped that was the way it would happen. At this point the detective told him that Anna was murdered. The news came as a shock to Professor. It looked like he understood that the two crimes are interconnected. The detective felt he could only cover one person, his stepson Kirill. The detective spoke with the polyclinic's janitor to verify the young man's alibi. She said that on that day the doctor was in his office. He locked himself in and was working. The lights could be seen through the window. Clearly, the janitor's conclusion was purely circumstantial. The man could have left the lights on in his office. Thus, Kirill's alibi was shaken. The 24-year-old Anna Khristenko is murdered with a lethal dose of adrenaline administered intravenously. Evidently, the girl did not resist the injection. The investigators established that the victim is Professor Lubomirov's extramarital daughter. He had insisted on her moving to Kyiv after her mother's death, promised to register her in his apartment, gave her expensive gifts. The conclusion the detectives make is that Anna was standing on the way of Professor's stepson Kirill. The suspicion heats up when it becomes obvious that he faked his alibi. The detective saw Kirill walk out of the polyclinic. The young man attempted an escape, which called for an immediate detention and taking him for interrogation. Results of forensic examination were presented to Kirill, proving that he was in the botanical garden with Anna. A fragment of a fingerprint on the button found in the victim's hand matched the young doctor's fingerprints. The same also referred to the fingerprint on the chocolate foil. Kirill was definitely lying to investigators when he denied knowing the girl in the photo. But why? Kirill said that he had seen Anna just a couple of times, which is why he did not recognize her. This answer, however, failed to explain what he was doing at the botanical garden. The detective warned him the court will consider his confession as a reason to reduce his sentence. Kirill gave in and told that before Anna came into their lives, Professor promised to give his apartment to his stepson and to buy him a car. But then, once Lubomirov made it clear that Kirill will have to live with his mother after the wedding. At the time, he had no idea that Anna was his stepfather's native daughter. He thought that the old man was out of his mind and was planning to give everything away to his mistress. He tried to convince Professor that a 40-year younger Anna was no match for him, that all she needs from him is his money. As Lubomirov remained adamant, Kirill decided to prove to his stepfather that Anna would easily cheat on him with a younger suitor. He made an acquaintance with her, started to see her, but then he realized Anna holds on tightly to the old man. It called for tough actions, and Kirill saw no choice to removing the girl from his way. He knew Anna was concerned with her health and wanted to have a contrast X-ray test. Kirill said it could be done in his clinic. However, this procedure is stiffly controlled, but he knew the way to override it. He would officially report the loss of a contrast injection dose, but will be unable to make a shot at the polyclinic. They have to do it elsewhere and then to go to the X-ray room. No one will know they are performing a contrast test. He will record it as a regular X-ray. He suggested a meeting at the botanical garden to make an injection there. The naive girl had no idea the syringe is filled with a lethal dose of adrenaline. At some point she panicked, and to calm her down, Kirill offered her some chocolate. Because of poor lighting, the needle hit her vein only after the third attempt. The deadly shot gave an immediate effect. Kirill wanted to pull the coat sleeve on her hand to mislead the investigation, but accidental passers-by scared him off. Leaving the botanical garden, Kirill noticed that one button was missing on his coat. Returning to the crime scene appeared dangerous, and the young man came up with a new plan. He decided to mislead the police. His coat was identical to his stepfather's, and so were the buttons on these coats. Kirill came to Professor's place, hit him, tore a button off his coat, and staged the robbery. The cumulative offenses underpinned Kirill's punishment, 12 years in prison.